All right, we're now streaming live on Facebook. I am being told on Zoom. So we'll go ahead and get started. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Breakdown with the Santa Fe Housing Action Coalition. So thanks for joining us tonight. If you haven't joined us before, The Breakdown is basically a monthly web series that focuses on everything housing. So here in Santa Fe and across the state. My name is Michael Barrio, and I'm the Executive Director for the Santa Fe Housing Action Coalition. And we're basically a broad coalition of community partners and stakeholders concerned with creating and ensuring an equitable and accessible housing landscape for all of us. And I'll also be your host. So tonight, our episode is going to focus on land use and planning. So we're going to talk about what that is, why it's important for development and sustainability, and then what all this stuff means for housing in Santa Fe. And I think it's important to, just so we have a common definition of what we're talking about, land use planning generally refers to the practice where, people with land, developers, municipalities, and others work to approve a land-based project following principles that promote an appropriate social and environmental effect, let's say, while also employing resources efficiently. So that's what we're referring to when we're going to talk about land use and planning. So right now, I feel like this is a pretty good time to talk about land use and planning, especially as we're coming off of the mayor's announcement last month that the Affordable Housing Trust Fund will have a pretty significant investment, which is awesome, and it's a great step forward. So, with that news, I feel like it's really an appropriate time to talk about all the other pieces that are part of the housing puzzle. And right now, all across the country, city residents and governments are all struggling with housing costs. They're most explicitly linked to housing through property assessments and the collection of property taxes, which is typically a top revenue source for cities, but they're still facing a diverse set of challenges that stem from housing affordability issues. So common sense, as housing becomes less affordable in a city or any geographic area, homelessness rises, right? Increasing the cost of health and human services. Commutes lengthen, and that increases the costs to maintain transportation infrastructure. Economic activity stagnates when businesses have a hard time attracting employees who can actually afford to live in the cities and communities they're being asked to work in. And initiatives that are designed to increase the housing stock using public funds can be pretty difficult due to limits on funding at the state, local, state, and federal levels. And we know all of that because we have been and are still experiencing this. So although cities have traditionally invested federal funding that's earmarked for affordable housing, we really can't rely solely on federal funds. So anyway, this episode of The Breakdown is going to explore the role of cities in planning for development and in enacting zoning and land use ordinances that encourage the construction of affordable housing, as well as other city tools that may not require much new funding at all. Because, when housing is unaffordable, city staffs and budgets are super strained, especially when you're coming out of and still going through a global pandemic. And so the demand for city services increases. And then more importantly, the city's residents suffer, and we're seeing that, right? So cities may not have the funding necessary to build hundreds and thousands of new affordable units, but the role that they play in planning and zoning provides opportunities to develop new tools that still improve everybody's lives. So that's what we're here to talk about tonight. So let's jump right in. Tonight, my guests are Eli Isaacson and Carlos Gamora from Land Use Department. And hey guys, so why don't you introduce and then just let's go ahead and just jump right in. Tell us a little bit about your department, what you're working on, and then we can get to how it's linked to housing.
Sure. So my name is Eli Isaacson. I am the Planning and Land Use Director for the City of Santa Fe. The city's land use department does more than just planning. We also are responsible for construction permitting, as well as construction inspections, and our civil engineering team is also within land use for development review. And then we also have our current planning team, which Carlos is a member of, as well as Historic Preservation Division, our Metropolitan Planning Organization, which looks at regional transportation planning, as well as bicycle and pedestrian mobility and trails. And then we also have our code enforcement team in land use as well. So with that, I can turn it over to Carlos and allow him to introduce himself, and we can jump into discussion.
Yeah. Thank you, Eli, and thank you, Michael. So my name is Carlos Gamora. I'm a senior land use planner in the land use department for the city of Santa Fe. And so I've been working on different ways to think about how we can use regulations within the land use department and think about how we can make sure that regulations are reflecting the needs, wants, values, and priorities of the community. So that's something that we're definitely trying to work on all the time. I like to think about land use planning and the regulations as being, very much intended to maintain health in the built environment. So that's thinking about, homes, hangouts, workplaces, parks, those kinds of things. So we use land use regulations. A lot of times that's in the form of zoning laws to make sure that we've got enough private open space on different residential developments, to make sure that buildings aren't too high, they're not too big, that we've got somewhat nice landscaping, that we've got enough parking, that buildings are complying with aesthetic and cultural Santa Fe style. The challenge is that the regulations that we apply can also increase the cost of development, can increase uncertainty, can limit the amount of housing that's actually built, and they could encourage socioeconomic segregation, where certain demographics live in one part of the city and very different demographics live in another. And so it's something that, while the regulations that we use are intended to create a healthy, pleasant, and thriving city, they can also do the opposite. And that's what we have to be careful about, and that's what we're always trying to reevaluate. With a focus on housing, our current regulations and practices have resulted in various kinds of prohibitions and challenges for a lot of residential construction. So for a lot of good reasons, we've said that we don't want too much housing in the hills of Santa Fe. We don't want too much in the historic districts. We don't want too much housing impacting existing neighborhoods, too much housing that's near existing neighborhoods. We don't want projects that are too big. We don't want to have too much traffic. We don't want things to look ugly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that comes down to these values, is how do we think about community values and priorities, and also how we want that to get regulated. The hard part is that before we start jumping into some of the values conversations, before we really start understanding how all of this fits together in a comprehensive way, something that the city's really been pushing, and we now have funding for, is thinking about growth management. And so that's really trying to understand, what is the amount of growth that we're dealing with? Where should that growth go? A huge question that will be part of that is, should we allow anyone that wants to live within Santa Fe to live here in an affordable and safe way? If that's the case, we'd have to build a lot more housing. And it's not up to staff like Eli and myself to determine what the answer is. It's not up to us to determine where that goes. It's really us trying to facilitate those questions to understand, how is growth working, and where would the community want that to go? Where does that make sense? Yeah. Eli, do you want to talk more about some of the growth management RFP and some of the stuff you're thinking about with that?
Sure. I think sort of before jumping into that, I think it might be valuable to talk a little bit about the recently adopted FY22 city budget and what is going on and how the land use department is impacted by that budget. So one of the things in this budget that was just recently passed is some money set aside to re-engage the community in conversations around long-range planning, specifically through the lens of growth and growth management. And I'm happy to talk about that. But I think before jumping into that, I think it's also important to talk about some of the other things that are included in this budget for the land use department and how this year's budget really responds to a lot of the things we're dealing with as a department and as a community. So we've added, as many of you know, last year with the pandemic, our city budget was hit very, very hard. Part of the reason why it was hit so hard is because the city is funded heavily, and my department is funded almost exclusively by gross receipts tax into the general fund. A lot of that gross receipts tax is generated by industries that were really hit hard by the pandemic, specifically around tourism and other service type industries, hospitality industries. And so we saw I think roughly 30% decrease in my department's budget in FY21 in anticipation of the decreased revenues coming into the city due to the pandemic. This year, as we're starting to come out of the pandemic and as we're starting to see more economic growth, we are building back key departments in the city, one of which is land use. Part of the reason why land use is such a key department right now in the city is because of, as many of you may notice, just driving around town, we are in the midst of a construction boom here in Santa Fe. So in response to the pandemic, I had to freeze vacancies. I am now in the process of unfreezing some vacancies, and I will unfreeze 4 more vacancies as part of the FY22 budget. Those vacancies are in areas around our development services teams, in areas of permitting, inspections, and development review. I'm also going to add 4 new positions to the department. Those positions are also in areas related to growth and development in the city. One position is in our planning team, which Carlos is a member of, and that position is a planner position that is funded through administrative fees. We're allowed to use a small percentage of our impact fee funds to put towards administration of that program. And that program is directly tied to this question about growth in the city. Impact fees are fees we charge developers and developments to pay for additional roadways, public safety, and parks. And so we'll be adding a planner to the team to oversee our impact fees and our impact fee capital improvements program and our capital improvements advisory committee, as well as doing some reporting around growth trends that we're seeing in the city. So that's on the personnel side. We are seeing, a lot more capacity coming into the department, which is great because we really need it because we are dealing with a tremendous amount of volume around growth and development in the department. But we're also adding money into our contracts and services line item, and that's around 2 large projects. The first project is land use code update. As many of you know, our land use code has been updated sort of piece by piece over many, many years. And where we're at now is we have a land use code that has areas that are not consistent with one another throughout the code. And that provides some inconsistency and some challenges to staff when reviewing different types of applications that we're seeing. So we are doing what we're calling a code cleanup project, which is really looking at consistency, clarifications, also looking at some of the processes that we have in the land use department that are spelled out by code around reviewing applications and development proposals to try to streamline things. And as Michael mentioned, land use code and land use regulation can add cost to projects and impact housing affordability in the community. So we're looking at ways to strip out some of those extra processes and what would be the right, just time that goes into those reviews to reduce the cost of development. And then the last thing, that Carlos mentioned is, we set aside $200,000 to do a growth management planning process. That is a community heavily focused on community engagement. As Carlos mentioned, it's around questions of trade-offs, about trying to understand what the community wants, and what the community is willing to give to get those outcomes around growth and development in the city. So that project, which will start, hopefully this fall, with the help of some consultants, ties in really nicely with the land use code update, because what we're doing is we are sort of cleaning up the code, doing this long range planning, public participation process, and then we'll have a nice sort of code that is ready to then update again and implement the policy recommendations of the growth management planning process, so that our growth management planning strategies and our land use code work with one another to deliver the types of outcomes in the built environment that we're all looking for. So that's just a quick update on the budget and where we're going over the next fiscal year in the land use department.
Awesome. Thank you, Eli. So I wanted to touch on a few things before you guys head into what else you guys are going to talk about. But I just wanted to come back to a couple of things you said. So like the departmental capacity, I think, is a super important piece, right? I've spent a lot of time, obviously I spend a lot of time talking to advocates and, all across the state. And, we spend a lot of time, as advocates do, fighting and asking for policy change and for funding for various initiatives. But I think that an area that we can do a whole lot more in is pushing for capacity as well. Because, in order to actually get the things implemented that we're looking at, right? And funding isn't the end of the conversation, and neither is the changing of policy, right? We have to work on making sure that the departments and the people that actually work on implementation are able to do that. And so I think it's really important that that's a piece of this conversation. I'm really glad to hear about the budget inclusion for your department as well. Oh, and another thing that I wanted to just kind of touch on before, and I think we're going to get to all of this, but, so we're talking about the growth management process, and that's really all about policy conversations, right? And then thinking about, what policies do we want in place? And then how do those policies shape the way that our city grows, right? And then that really forces us to ask the question, then how should we be thinking about growth and incentives? And I think those are really important questions when we're talking about this growth management process, especially, going back to something Carlos said, we're talking about, values, right? And what our values are as a community. And Eli, you mentioned this too, having these important conversations with the community. And I think it's super important because I'm wondering, just myself, how are too much and ugly defined, right? Like those are pretty subjective terms. And I feel like we use we hear a lot of commonplace in policy discussions, right? Anyone can get on a stage and say, I support freedom, and the whole crowd's going to cheer, but that means something different to everybody, right? So,
right, exactly.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, how are those things defined? And then what do those conversations look like? Because the community, I think, has a lot of anxiety about, these kinds of processes. And, you mentioned a construction boom, right? So there is a construction boom in Santa Fe. And I think that the community sees that. And then on the other side of the coin asks, but where's all the affordable housing development? Or where's the housing development in general that, the working class can afford? And so it's kind of like this weird, I see this boom, but where's all the other stuff that we need, right?
Yeah. Let me just mention, first with the housing boom, there's two really distinct ways that we could think about, housing affordability and a healthy housing ecosystem. And there is the capital A affordability, which is funded by the Santa Fe Housing Trust, which is thinking about low and medium income housing. Those, the inclusion of those units, it's really hard to build something new that's also, very low priced. It's hard to do that. And so creating more low and median income housing, we absolutely need to be doing 100%. And things like the Housing Trust Fund is a great way towards getting towards that. Having new construction of those units is also a way to get to that. And that's really kind of a ground up, really like how do we target those uses and build those? And unfortunately, that's not as much a strength of land use. Land use is more of a broad brush, is more broadly thinking about how does the entire kind of housing ecosystem work? How does the entire market work? And how can we start to incentivize some market developers to start to do that? So when we're thinking about the smaller A affordability, we're thinking about what is affordable for all different kinds of income groups and how can we make those work? Now, there are some amendments and changes that we can make to the land use code to actually incentivize that capital A affordable, to really start thinking about, right now we're requiring 15% inclusion of set aside units that are technical stuff, but like we require low and moderate income units on some projects, but we also have fee in lieu. But I mean, we can use the land use code to make those options to make those more attractive for developers. But some of the larger growth management conditions are more just thinking about how do we want the housing ecosystem to work? How much housing do we want in Santa Fe? And then talking about some of the trade-offs, Michael, I think you're absolutely correct that we don't have a great definition for what is ugly, what is too high, what is too big, what is too much of an impact. Those are all subjective concerns. Now, we could point to the land use code, and I could tell you that 2 stories in most single-family residential neighborhoods, 2 stories is sometimes a challenge, and 3 stories is, according to the code, oftentimes too high. Now, does the community always think that? We're not always sure. That's really like evaluating how would we define what is too high, what is too ugly, what is too big, what fits in with the community. And again, those processes are really trying to understand what are the things that we want and what are the things that we're willing to give up for that.
Yeah, and how do the wants map to the needs too?
Yeah. So I love landscaping. I love trees. I love open space. Personally, right? Just me as a person. But we also have to balance. To what degree do we want to have trees and views of sunsets and ample amounts of parking and low heights and beautiful buildings with expensive finishes, and to what degree do we want housing, right?
So, absolutely. So picking up on what you were just saying, Carlos, I mean, we do have instances where the code defines too high, correct?
Right.
So we were recently dealing with a development application along the South Central Highway Corridor Protection Area at Zia and St. Francis. By code, anything above 24 feet is too high because there's an overlay district that makes, that prohibits higher construction. And so the applicant was asking to be removed from that overlay boundary because they felt that 3 stories was not only appropriate for the site, but also required if affordable housing was going to be able to be a part of that project. The actual units were going to be able to be provided on site. And so questions that have come up because of that, those public hearings around that project have really brought to light this question of trade-offs of, are we willing to exchange views from our roadways and the entry experience of our city in exchange for higher density development that's a little bit taller, but also provides affordable housing opportunities for members of our community. And so that is in some ways emblematic of this larger conversation we need to have citywide about what is appropriate for our city now, facing the challenges we face around providing housing for a full cross-section of our population. What are the appropriate things that we'd be willing to give up to be able to provide that equitable opportunity for everyone? And so that's, as Carlos mentioned earlier, not a question that I myself can answer for our community. not a question that Carlos can answer for our community, but it's a conversation our community needs to have, and it needs to happen in a facilitated dialogue where the outcomes of that conversation can be turned into land use policy that can be implemented through our land use regulations, so that we can build towards that common vision for the future of Santa Fe. And so that's really where the growth management planning comes into place, and the role of the general public in shaping those ideas, those values, and those policies.
And it seems like it's really a part of this bigger conversation about, what, if we're talking about values, how do we define ourselves as a community as well? What do we talk about the importance of community? Because I think, again, that's another one of those commonplace terms. And when I'm thinking about community, I'm thinking that community means a whole lot more than just four walls and property values, right? So if we can agree on that, then I feel like what the problem is that there's some cognitive dissonance between the wants and the needs, which is why I was saying, how do those two things map to each other? Because I don't know, I feel like, one of the problems is that opposition to new housing has really has bipartisan agreement, right? I mean, there's blue cities, right, that are full of voters who say that they want a more equitable and accessible society. And they're consistently voting to push housing costs onto others. So they'll vote for higher taxes to fund social programs, but they also make sure that whatever affordable housing does get built is built far away from them. And then you've got the red suburbs full of everybody that says that they want regulation, or that regulation should be minimal, and then property rights protected, but then at the same time insist that the local governments legislate a million little rules that dictate what can be built and where. So, and then we have to think about, reducing urban sprawl, right? So we don't want to just keep pushing people to the outskirts of the city. We've already got enough of our workforce working in Rio Rancho and living in Rio Rancho, right? But so, I don't know, it's kind of one of those things where I feel like, and this is something that you guys are working on, and that we're kind of trying to help us understand tonight. But I feel like the zoning codes are most often the culprits for undermining some of those goals. And I know that the zoning code is one of the unsexiest things that a local government might be charged with working on. Maybe not the unsexiest, but one of them. And so any kind of little change, I feel like, and if we're looking at like processes and efficiencies and things like that, it seems like almost every little change kind of forces a discussion about the realities of growth, right? And it kind of hits the idealistic goals of city planners against the protectiveness of the longtime residents or any residents that are defending the value of their single biggest investment most of them have made in their lives, and that's their homes, right? So again, when we ask ourselves what kind of community we want to be, I feel like this has to be a conversation that's more than just about property values and the views that we get from the homes that we bought when we arrived here from out of state, quite frankly. So yeah.
So just one quick clarification. I mean, it's a great point. I just want to make sure that I didn't get into this when I was talking about the land use code update earlier, but I just want to be really clear that this first phase of our land use code update is not jumping into those substantive changes that you're sort of talking about, Michael. It's more about, as Dan Werwath has called it in the past, code hygiene, right? Where really cleaning up the code and having a really clean and strong foundation from a Chapter 14 land use code perspective that we can then incorporate the substantive changes that come out of this public engagement process, where we have these really meaningful conversations that, our intention is to make it as inclusive as possible, really trying to get, different people engaged in the planning process than are typically participate, really trying to get people involved that younger folks that have more of a vested interest in the outcomes, right? That will be in our city for a longer amount of time and will be impacted by the decisions we make now well into the future, into their adult lives. And so we really are going to try to make this as inclusive as possible, get as many voices involved in the process as possible so that we can really come up with policy recommendations that really represent our entire community and aren't skewed towards current homeowners or current property owners or recent arrivals to our city, but really include everyone so that we're not sort of making recommendations for moving forward that are biased towards any one special interest group. So that's kind of where we're at. I just wanted to make sure that that was clear.
Yeah. And I just want to say, that's an important distinction. And I also want to say that those, while you may not be working on, what you called some of the more substantive pieces of that, those, doing that code hygiene or assessment bit, that I feel like that's probably one of the most critical pieces, though, because it's so foundational, right? And so because those are the pieces that are either powering or inhibiting any kind of efficiency or any kind of development, right? And so it seems like working on those at that level is just such a critical foundational piece to get to those other pieces.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. This was something that we intended to jump into last fiscal year, but that money that we had set aside to start this process was pulled back into the city's general fund due to the budget shortfalls caused by the pandemic. And so we're doing it a little bit later than we had initially hoped, but in the grand scheme of things, with this additional effort sort of in growth management planning, those two efforts are sort of on parallel tracks and then come together at the end in our final phase of the land use code update, which is the land use code is one of our best opportunities to implement the growth management plan. And so that's really sort of the last phase of the project, is updating our land use code to include those recommendations and turn those policies into regulations, so that, moving forward, future development is aligned with what the community said they wanted in terms of growth management in the city.
Yeah, to think some more about phases too. What the city is proposing right now is really, how do we clean things up so that we can understand our code? And how do we dig in and start to understand growth? How do we understand some of those questions about growth? Now, the long-range planning, community engagement, updating code, making sure that code reflects community values, all of those things should be iterative processes that are kind of ongoing. We should be facilitating that kind of community dialogue. But some of the hardest questions that we have to answer, we still don't have all of the information that we need to know. We also, staff and the community has struggled with developing a good vocabulary for understanding and discussing these issues. And so the intention is not to let's get a bunch of people into a room and ask them complex questions about things that we don't even all understand. The intention is that first, let's figure out some of what we're dealing with. Let's start practicing this language. Let's start understanding each other a little more. Let's start building more of those connections so that when we start moving to the next phases, we've got the information that we know. We have some of those relationships, and then you could dig into more of those incredibly difficult and sticky questions about what is too high, what is too big, what's a bad impact, what's a good impact, what are we willing to give up? Those are hard questions that we want to get to, that Santa Fe as a city has to get to, but also we've got to build that capacity so that we could actually have a conversation in a right way, a conversation that's inclusive of different groups. So it takes time. It takes time.
It does.
Yeah, I mean, I would just to piggyback on that. I mean, I think from my conversations I have with constituents and elected officials, appointed officials, I mean, I think there's some alignment on the questions, but I think in terms of the answers, the answers there's all over the place. I don't think, I think that there's a lot of disagreement in the community over the answer to the question is how high is too high. And
right.
So we really need to engage in this, this public dialogue around these questions that everyone seems to be seems to be top of mind for a lot of people in our community,
Yeah.
so that we can come to some level of agreement that allows us then to plan for our future. And so that is really the critical first step in any sort of long range planning process, is really trying to get some, not necessarily consensus, but some sort of agreement within the community around these critical questions, so that we can then sort of build our regulations and our policies around those answers to achieve those outcomes.
Well, speaking of sticky questions, I have some questions from some audience members. So I'm going to go ahead and start asking some of those. So the first one I'm going to jump into, and this is actually easy. This is not a sticky one at all. You kind of touched on some of this. So what is the department's role in developing affordable housing?
So that's a great question. Carlos, why don't you jump in on that one?
Sure. Directly developing, we don't develop anything really, right? Like we don't have the budget. We're not moving forward. We're not funding projects, and we're not, hammering in drywall, right? As far as how we can encourage people, we can use regulations to either discourage or to encourage certain kinds of construction. So we have right now, we've got a lot of regulations that prevent, dense construction. We have regulations that charge fees for different kinds of building that we're doing. Something that we could do is we could incentivize or pull out some of the restrictions we have on affordable housing. So if you build affordable housing, we could give larger fee waivers. If you build affordable housing, we could reduce the processing times. We could lessen the development requirements. We could lessen the design requirements. We could add flexibility. We can, there's a million different processes that we could change to incentivize or work with the big A affordable housing. And those are things that we've considered. Those are things that we'd love to actually move forward. Again, as a department, as staff, as public servants, we're not proposing what is the right regulations for the community. All we could do is come up with options. So I can't say that incentivizing big A affordable housing should be a community priority. I could only say that if it is a community priority, here's some options that we could do. And yeah, we have spent time trying to figure out what that could be, what examples of that could be.
I think we also have one other sort of important role in the affordable housing, in the delivery of affordable housing, and that is our role as reviewers, right? So we review every project that comes to land use, every development proposal, to ensure that the development meets our inclusionary zoning and affordable housing requirements. So that's one of the big things land use does, is we work really closely with Alexandra Ladd in the Office of Affordable Housing. She's responsible for working with the applicant to figure out how they are going to meet and satisfy the requirements from an affordable housing standpoint for the project. And then it's the role of land use through our approvals process to make sure that those requirements are met in the project, whether it's through payment of the fee in lieu, or if it's around making sure that the number of units in the development are in fact affordable, whether it's a rental product or a for sale product. So we do have a role from a regulatory side in ensuring that developers live up to their end of the bargain, so to speak, on these projects.
So there's the regulation, which I was talking about, and Eli, thank you. There's also the enforcement side of really making sure that groups are actually complying with the codes and regulations that we have. Yeah.
Okay. So the next question sounds simple, but okay. So how much land does the city own that could be used for affordable housing?
I don't have an acreage number available. I'm happy to follow up on that question with more specifics. I know Carlos has been working closely with Alexandra Ladd in developing strategies for us to dispose of city-owned assets for the purpose of developing affordable housing. So he may have a better sense of what that number is. The city owns a lot of what we call scattered sites within the city, which are smaller sort of parcels here and there. Some of them have been come up in community conversations around affordable housing in the past. I think one of the big ones recently was conversation about affordable housing at the handball courts over on Zia and Yucca. But we have sites like that scattered throughout the city, some slightly larger, some slightly smaller. And then the city owns some big tracts of land around 599 and the northwest quadrant, and is also what is it, Los Estrellas, which is
right.
Yeah, which is up around Ridgetop Road and 599 on the sort of north side of 599. So those are some of the larger tracts that the city owns that can be used for housing. And then we also have these much smaller sites sort of scattered throughout the city that also are opportunities for housing and possibly affordable housing. But I think it's important to talk about, smaller sites are challenging to provide affordable housing because of some of the things Carlos was talking about. Right now, just construction costs are going through the roof. So one metric
on the price of lumber.
Well, so yeah, that's absolutely true. So, there's a standard unit of measurement for tracking lumber costs, and it's 1,000 board feet of lumber. It's just a board foot is sort of a complicated concept, but there's a unit called 1,000 board feet of lumber that builders track the cost of that to see where material costs are. And the cost of 1,000 board feet of lumber has gone up 5-fold in the last 9 to 12 months. A sheet of plywood right now is going for $70 a sheet. I mean, it's crazy where materials are going right now. And so that really
that's what makes those kinds of
affordability, right?
Challenging too, is that people are hearing about these things peripherally without all of the context or information. So like on the one hand, they're hearing like, wow, the cost of lumber is crazy right now, right? And it makes everything so much more difficult to build and develop. And then they're just like, oh, but there's also a building boom happening right now. Like, wait a minute, like, so it's
two are directly related to one another, right? I mean, they're not separate issues. So because of the construction boom that's happening, not just locally, but nationwide, we have seen, material costs just creeping up steadily since, basically last summer. And that is continuing to go up. And, I've talked to lots of different people. There's different theories as to why these costs are going up. Some say it's a supply issue because of, everything from beetle infestation in the pine forests of Canada, to other people are saying, we have, the hurricane season last year was extremely long, and people needed lots of plywood to board up their homes and businesses. And, costs of plywood have just gone up ever since, and people are willing to pay it. So the lumber companies are willing to charge it. So, there's lots of different factors feeding into those rising material costs, but they're real. And so these rising costs really challenge the ability to provide or deliver affordable housing if your development costs are also rising, at a very high rate. So it's something to consider as well.
And those are really, as Eli was saying, those are real costs that make development, quite a bit more expensive, and really, end up with people trying to get around, raising housing costs, right? Mm-hmm. It directly leads to rising housing costs. But similarly, our internal regulations do the same thing. So Eli brought up the handball courts, 4.6 acres there. If we wanted to develop that for affordable housing, we could do 4 units because it's zoned R1, right? So a fairly large property, but you can't really do anything on it. Now, maybe we could change the zoning and go through an incredibly expensive process to try to do that. But it would still be really hard to develop that site with anything of value. you're not going to be able to get any kind of affordability at a unit per acre.
But so I guess
we
the
were to,
question would then be like, okay, so if it's like this expensive and kind of massive undertaking, it sounds like, to adjust the code to ensure, like, okay, maybe we want to build multifamily rental housing on this space that you're talking about, right? But we can't because of the code. But it's going to be so expensive and this crazy undertaking to change it. But my question then would be, like, wouldn't that be a smarter investment for the future of development in the city? Like, if we
absolutely.
did spend that money and did take on that undertaking?
Now, I think it is difficult because, Eli and I don't choose budget, right? That's also,
right.
Community priorities, right? So
my question also doesn't allow for the fact that a lot of other things go into this, right? But I mean,
right.
Because if I'm being honest, I don't know exactly what that undertaking would look like. I know it would be expensive. I know it'd be a big undertaking, but I don't know, as the public doesn't, all of the other little pieces that go into making something like that happen.
So can I take a slightly different approach to your?
Yeah.
I think, and this goes back to the reason why, the city wants to undertake this growth management planning process, where I think we have been, so over the past few years, right, we've been dealing with a lot of these one-off rezoning application conversations, right, where an applicant comes in, they own a piece of property, it's zoned R3, they want it to be R5 because they need that number of units to make the development pencil out. And so they have to come to planning commission, they have to go to city council, and we have these very contentious and passionate conversations about whether or not we should upzone this property, right? And we have that conversation over and over and over again on a one-off basis. And I think where we would like to go as a city is to engage the city as a whole, the community as a whole, in conversations about what is the appropriate density for certain parts of our city. Why is the density appropriate there versus other places? Is it close to transit? Is it close to jobs? Is it close to open space? Is it close to infrastructure? And asking those questions and identifying areas of our city that are more or better suited, I should say, to receiving higher density infill development, then we don't have to have these one-off conversations about whether or not a single property in our city should be zoned R1 or R5, but we get to have a conversation about our city as a whole, about where are the appropriate places for us to densify. Because ultimately, right, to achieve our sustainability goals, to sustain our carbon goals, to sustain our equity, or to achieve our equity goals, to do all of those things really is going to require increasing the density of development in certain parts of our city. And so let's have this conversation talking about the city as a whole, instead of having this conversation at the application level at one individual piece of property within the city. And so your question about investment, I think, is the right approach, but I would say let's invest in a way that we can have the conversation comprehensively, rather than investing in having that conversation as a city just at the corner of Yucca and Zia. And so that would be my response to that sort of question about, are we investing in the right areas?
And I think that kind of speaks to the comment that Justin made in the comments, is that the code hygiene should include a rezoning map. It's kind of like this part of this comprehensive discussion. So your answer was actually, that's exactly kind of the context that I think is missing for the majority of the public, right? Because those are kinds of the things that kind of occur behind the scenes that we don't really see. So
we're certainly, just really quickly on that point, Michael. So we're still developing the growth management plan scope of work. That's a sort of a conversation that's happening internally. But I can say that one of the outcomes of the growth management plan will be an updated future land use map. And the future land use map is really important because that is what guides rezoning requests. And so we will be looking at, not necessarily looking at rezoning large portions of the city, I don't think, but I think I do feel more confident that we will be updating our future land use map, which will identify areas of the city where densification is most appropriate.
Okay.
And then as projects come forward and rezonings are requested at those locations, we have a future land use map that guides the decision-making process of whether those rezoning applications are in alignment with our future planning or not. And so that is one of the things that we will definitely be taking on as part of this process.
Is that future planning map, is that prescriptive? Like, is that something that, you know, that can't be veered away from, you know, if the environment changes, whether that's like an economic, you know?
So the process for changing the future land use map is analogous to changing the zoning map. You know, it's a general plan amendment and then what we usually do typically is at the same time, if you applied for a rezoning application to the city, the land use department would process that as a rezoning request and a general plan amendment. And the general plan amendment is a change to the future land use map. So it is prescriptive, but it's also not set in stone. There is a process for requesting changes to that map.
Cool. All right.
And Michael, talking about priorities too, like investments, absolutely, you know, investing in these processes, investing in community engagement, and really trying to make sure that our regulations are reflecting where we want to go as a community is absolutely something that you know we should do. The hard part is that it's also very expensive and very time consuming if you do it right. So the governing body could come together and rezone every property in Santa Fe, but it won't be done right if we don't actually have community engagement, if we don't have the community capacity to engage, if we don't actually have that input. If that's not being done right, then huge problem. So it does get quite involved, and that's again where breaking this up into different pieces and trying to work on those different pieces is the only way that we're really able to do that right now. And again, it should be. I think if the city was trying to do everything at once, it should raise some huge eyebrows about what kind of corners we're cutting.
Yeah, that's all right. Let me see if we're going to try and get to two more questions. We actually got a few more than I expected, but let's see. So how are regulations currently enforced? And I'm specifically and this is the question, I'm specifically thinking about limited capacity and how, well, the rest, I can't make out the rest, but yeah, how are regulations enforced currently? Especially thinking about limited capacity.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I totally understand the question, but we have regulations. So we have local zoning and land use regulations. Those are in Chapter 14, and that's has a lot to do with everything from terrain management, saying how much you can build on how steep of slopes, what are your stormwater retention requirements, things like that, to more zoning and use-based requirements, things like setbacks and building heights and things like that. Then we also have building codes, right? Those are international building codes that the city has adopted that we require all construction to adhere to. So how do we enforce it? Well, we enforce it in several ways. On developments, we either can handle those administratively, where we review them internally to make sure they align to our code, or larger developments that require development plans go to planning commission, where they're reviewed by the planning commission to make sure they follow Chapter 14. We enforce, we have property maintenance codes that the land use department enforces, to make sure that people aren't, keeping too many junk vehicles in their front yard, or that their weeds are too tall. And we enforce that with our enforcement team. They go out and issue notices of violation when they find code violations, and give property owners opportunities to remediate and remedy those. So there's lots of different ways that we enforce our local regulations. In terms of capacity, I don't want to read too much into it, but we, as Carlos has alluded to in some of his previous comments, there's things in our land use code that prevent someone from building on 100% of their property, right? Things like lot coverage limitations, things like setback requirements, things like height requirements. And so the way we enforce that is through our either planning approvals process or construction permitting approvals process. And as Carlos was saying, there's opportunities to start rejiggering those regulations, which would allow for, you know, more efficient, you could say, use of property. However, that expanded horizontal or lot coverage, horizontal development or lot coverage, there's trade-offs to that. Your buildings are closer to your neighbors' buildings. There's less open space. There's less opportunity for landscaping. And so, again, it goes back to this notion of what are the trade-offs? What are we willing to give to get the type of built environment we all want?
Awesome. Okay. The next one is, what is the department doing to help implement more inclusionary approaches to zoning and land?
So I think we've covered a lot of, that already. I think
so.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been really sort of what we've been talking about this evening. But some other things that we haven't talked about, you know, we are looking at, we are doing things like we recently updated our short-term rental ordinance. We are looking at, as Carlos has mentioned, we're really looking at housing as sort of an ecosystem and looking at ways that the city can update its policies and its ordinances to make housing more affordable in our city. And we're really trying to approach that question from lots of different angles. And I think the growth management planning process that we've been talking about tonight is going to be make a really giant step in that direction.
And I also do want to touch on ENNs and things like that. So we require developers to go through an early neighborhood notification. The problem is that because we don't do the larger types of long-range comprehensive planning where we're reaching out to community and saying what is too high and not high enough, and what fits for the community, we have all of that condensed into a single project that the neighborhood does not get what they're looking for, the developer does not get what they're looking for, and the city does not get what they're looking for. So as far as having a more inclusive process in this, I don't think the city has done a great job of having an inclusive process about this in the past. The hope is that through processes like the growth management plan, we could actually bring more of that into more of that inclusion into how city processes are being made. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. That makes sense. All right, I don't think we have time to substantively answer any other questions, but I just want to thank both of you for joining me this evening. I think there's just, I say this a lot, but the purpose of this series, is there's such a lack of general knowledge about and information about housing in general, right? Not just the housing crisis that we're currently facing, but housing in general. It's a big and complex issue with a lot of different pieces. So people don't really have an understanding of, what are the contributing factors, how do various initiatives and policy moves how are they interrelated with housing and development, right? And then when you add to that the amount of disinformation that exists in the community, from how and why fees in lieu work the way that they do, right? How project development works and how those decisions are made. So there's a lot of unknowns. And so the community only knows that there's not enough housing to go around, and what is there isn't affordable. And a lot of them are angry and a little anxious. And so a lot of times though, that anger is misdirected. And so these episodes, I think, I'm really hoping that they can do a lot to help inform people about, housing in general, everything that goes into it, and provide a forum for people to ask questions. So thank you both for agreeing to be here with me this evening. Thank you everybody for tuning in for our third episode of The Breakdown. We'll be back next month. There will be more on that on all of our social channels. So stay tuned, and we hope to see you next month. Again, Elias and Carlos, thank you so much for your time and answering
Thanks for having us. It was great.
Yeah, thank
questions.
you.
Yeah. Well, you guys have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Ciao.